One of the biggest problems we face with growing things on the moon is wondering what we would grow. I think this needs to be taken into great consideration and thought about because if you don't know what you're going to grow, then what is all this for? But because we will be using a nutrient additives with the hydroponic system, we need to look for plants high in yield. We're going to have these hydroponic systems, but we're really going to need to think about how much space we're going to be able to dedicate. So if we have a plant that is small but produces lots of a certain vegetable or fruit, then we can make the most out of the space that we have. This means that higher yield equals less space needed. So if our plants can produce lots of vegetables, we don't need as many of them. Obviously, this isn't the most productive way whenever we're thinking about civilizing, but as far as space stations and other exploratory research goes, this is going to be our best bet. So some of the things I've found are leaf lettuce, for example. It's the most receptive to hydroponics. The plant itself can be cut back when the lettuce is ready to be harvested, and it'll produce a new crop from the same yield and plant that already existed. So this is going to save space and time when it comes to reseeding the hydroponic system. You're not going to have to do that with leaf lettuce because it naturally grows back by itself. So once you cut that plant, it'll just regenerate itself, and this means a lot considering we're going to have limited resources and space when it does come to this type of system. The next one I discovered was tomato. They're very high in yield and nutrient rich. So that means your plant, it's going to take up a little bit more space than leaf lettuce, but the nutrient value of that tomato is going to be much higher than leaf lettuce. So if you think about a tomato compared to lettuce, a tomato is going to be much more filling. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration when you look at the yield. So with that, the yield on the tomato plant is rather large. If we're going to have a controlled growing environment year round, your annual turns into a perennial. So for those of you that don't know, a perennial is a plant that lasts multiple seasons rather than just one. But in a controlled environment, your tomato plant will keep producing buds, which will equal tomatoes. And then last, squash. So certain types of squash, zucchini squash, cucumbers. I'd like to focus on cucumbers today. They're perfect for vertical gardening. And with that being said, it's going to be great in a hydroponic system. So those roots just need to make contact with the water. But as far as it's concerned, you can grow your squash or cucumber up a vine. So you could get your trellis, grow it up a vine in that hydroponic system, and your yield is going to be fantastic. Another thing with squash is that if it's in a controlled environment, it also becomes a perennial and can be grown for multiple seasons. Another thing I think we need to consider would be the option that if you're up there, eventually you're going to run out of your nutrient additive that's going to go in the water. So we might need to derive nutrients from lunar soil. So whenever I researched lunar soil, I found that it is very high in iron, magnesium, and manganese. That's fantastic because all three of those are micronutrients necessary for plant growth. So whenever I looked at that, I equated it to what plants grow great in manganese, iron, and magnesium. And whenever I researched that, I found a couple different options. Potatoes, for those of you that don't know, potatoes are a root vegetable. As far as being grown in hydroponics, it's not the best option, but it's definitely viable. But as we make that switch over from hydroponics to actually growing in the medium found on lunar soil, it's going to be fantastic. They're very shallow root vegetables, so they can be grown within the ground. And understanding that the lunar crust is not the same as crust on Earth, and we have limited surface area as well as how far down we can go, I think a shallow root vegetable like a potato would be a fantastic option. Another thing would be leafy vegetables. So like leaf lettuce that grows great in the hydroponic system, we can derive that iron that it takes to grow leafy vegetables and actually make them green. We can take that, refine that to lunar soil, extract those nutrients with a system that would also need to be created, and grow those vegetables with that nutrient additive derived from lunar soil. And then as well as tomatoes. So we talked about how tomatoes are perfect in a hydroponic system. That's also something. And all those good reasons to grow tomatoes also equivalent to the ability to extract that iron, magnesium, and manganese from the lunar soil. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Overall, I think your best bet would be to grow tomatoes on in space, as well as lettuce. Squash and potatoes are something that are going to be fantastic to grow, but with limited space, you'd have to be more selective. Obviously, if you had a larger operation, you'd be able to do multiple different things. But with the limited space and resources that we have, I think our best bets are going to be that tomato and lettuce. So with that being said, I also touched on the ability to derive nutrients from lunar soil. That's something that has to be researched. How do we extract those nutrients? A system to extract them. Normally on Earth, we'd be adding nutrients into the soil, but here we want to be able to take the nutrients out of the lunar soil to be able to use it for other purposes. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, in all honesty, because it's either you derive those nutrients from the soil and place them in water, or you add nutrient additives to the soil in place of water.
So the method that we're going to be using is hydroponics. Hydroponics is basically growing plants in the absence of soil. So this means that we can grow crops in substances such as sand or clay. This is very helpful for growing crops in less than optimal conditions. Plants can grow vertically or any way in which they need. So if we run into the obstacle of needing to conserve space, this would be a good idea to use. And it's the best idea for growing plants in space. And then this is because space is so vast and it has so many different places and so many different atmospheres, or no atmosphere at all. It's very challenging to think of how we can grow crops in space since we're so used to crops growing in our atmosphere. So this is a good idea since we are providing the plants with the conditions that they need. All their conditions will be met and they'll be able to grow. And this provides a chance of moving agriculture to places like the moon, which doesn't have any atmosphere at all. Hydroponics usually helps produce a larger yield and better version of the plant. So this provides us with a more substantial amount of food in space, and it also clears away our needing more transports from Earth to the moon. This clears that away because we are able to produce larger amounts of food for the people. However, all the conditions for the plant's needs should be provided for this to happen. So the plant needs the specific conditions that we must provide for them to grow. And so this turns out to be our main problem because we have to make sure that all the conditions that the plant needs to thrive are met and that it is able to grow in a way that is helpful for us. So that's the main problem of this, but this is the main way that we could grow plants in space.
Okay, so when we look at hydroponics in space, we need to look at the ideal conditions. So since I'm not an expert with all of this, I had to do a little bit of research. I found that they say that clay is better for use than just regular soil, and they've tried that in the past. I also found that places like the moon, and especially Mars, have what is known as regolith for soil. This soil can, and many times does, contain harmful bacteria that would be harmful for both the plants and humans. The plants would need consistent temperature, which is difficult to do in space. I know I've read about the moon, how it gets really warm during the day, like 200 or so, a little bit higher than that, 200 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night, about the negative of that, so really cold. I also read that it is best to have no bugs, which should be easy in space because as of right now, there is no other life other than Earth. According to a hydroponics article, a nutrient-rich water source is best. If there are harmful substances or too much salt, reverse osmosis could be used. In terms of lighting, which is important for plants, the article mentions high-intensity discharge, or HID, lighting to be the best option. It also mentions that there are two types of this lighting, which are metal halide and high pressure sodium. Essentially, we need clean water, proper soil, controlled temperature, good lighting, and no bugs. So next, I created this slide on the conditions of the moon. So like what would be beneficial for sustaining life and growing plants, and what would be harmful and would kind of set us back. So some pros, no bugs or pests. So the moon does not have anything that should like physically get into the plants. We have access to the sunlight on the moon. There are lots of impacts, so there is potential to find helpful resources that would otherwise be difficult to locate in space. And the moon probably has the closest conditions to Earth other than any other celestial body in terms of ability to sustain life. And then some negatives or cons is that the moon does not have an atmosphere for the protection of anything on the surface. So there will be direct radiation. You would basically be susceptible to all that is in space. So that would be something that would need to be fixed. We would need to create some kind of container or building out of very protective and hard materials that would house these plants, but also house those that are working on them, and hopefully be able to, like I said, protect the life there. The moon it has rough and potentially harmful regolith, and it has no water sources, as we know so far, other than the impacts. What's left over sometimes leaves residue of a little bit of water, not very much though. And then we also have drastic temperature changes, like extremely hot during the day and very cold at night. And then we have very low gravity, of course, as we know, it's like a fraction of the Earth's, and then, like I said, high radiation.
When it comes to space, the issue of water is not easy to solve. Not only is it necessary for humans to live, but for plants to grow as well. Survival in space won't be as simple as merely finding a source of water, but figuring out how to maintain what we already have. Regardless of what method is used to grow plants in space, water will be necessary. The sources from which water can be obtained, however, are limited. First and foremost, we could ship water from Earth into space. However, this is a very expensive option due to the water's weight, as costs are typically calculated on a per-pound basis. While sending shipments of water may not be suitable for a long-term solution, an initial shipment of water may be necessary to sustain our agricultural system. There is also the sabatier system, a method of creating water by condensing gases and transforming them. The vapor is then cycled into a water recovery system, while the byproducts are released into space. This system is currently utilized in space travel and habitation sponsored by NASA and has proven reliable. We may also be able to find water in other sources, such as asteroids. There has been talk about whether or not it would be possible to harvest water from asteroids, and it could potentially be a somewhat constant source. We do not anticipate this being an option in the near future, but it is certainly something to look into. Additionally, there may be other resources we are currently not aware of, like beneath the surface of planets. These alternative sources may or may not end up being an option, but that does not mean we should give up on them. Given the scarcity of water in regards to living in space, the next thing we need to look at is retainment. Filtration systems currently used in the International Space Station can recycle water from sweat, condensation, and urine. The last option may not sound the most ideal in terms of drinking water, but it certainly seems like a lesser evil when recycled into the agricultural system. There are methods that have already been invented that have the capacity to maintain the necessary levels of water we would need to keep our system running, like those currently utilized by NASA and the International Space Station. Depending on what agricultural system is used, runoff or condensation could potentially be recycled back into the system. One issue that we could run into is the nutritional value of the water, especially if it is filtered through a system again and again. The most obvious way to solve this problem is by adding nutrients to the water after it is recycled and/or filtered, but before it is put back into the system. Once again, massive shipments of these supplies are not necessarily ideal. However, there may be harvestable minerals that could be utilized depending on where the agricultural system is located.
So when considering hydroponics in space, it's important for us to look at the growing medium and water additives needed. For the growing medium, a variety of different materials have been proven effective. A few of those include grains and pebbles, such as lightweight expanded clay, aggregate, perlite, and vermiculite. This form of medium provides support and aeration for the plant, along with space for the plant's roots to grow. Another type is a foam matrix made of Rockwool and Oasis cubes. This medium is good for holding moisture while also providing a firm structure for the plants to grow. And the last type of growing medium is a fibrous organic material such as cocoa coir, parboiled rice, husks, and pine bark. This medium is really useful because it breaks down really slowly and has a pH range appropriate for most hydroponically grown plants. But we also have to consider the necessary water additives needed for a hydroponic system, and these include essential macronutrients like nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, as well as variable macronutrients like aluminum, silicone, and chlorine, and then non-essential macronutrients like sodium, cobalt, and lithium. So there's obviously a need for hydroponics in space, and that's for a few reasons. So first, we need food to survive, and this system can provide that for us. And vitamin deficiencies, like a lack of vitamin C, can cause many health problems, and growing and eating plants can ensure that this doesn't happen. And then lastly, it's been found that growing plants can be helpful for our psychological well-being, especially for those in space, like in the ISS, for those who are so far away from Earth and any life on Earth. And these pictures here are some plants that were grown on the ISS, and they were photographed by an astronaut with the backdrop of Earth.
So the main advantages of hydroponics in space, farmers on Earth can grow crops all year long, and this is because in a hydroponic environment, farmers are able to control the climate of it, and so they can grow crops in like the winter and things that we don't usually have plants growing in. So this provides optimal growing in space because space is so different from here on Earth. We are able to make the plants feel at home and if they are like on Earth. So hydroponic plants only use 10% of water compared to field-grown plants, and the water can be recycled. So this is super helpful because we run into the problem in space of not having water. So growing plants they're a challenge. So with hydroponic plants not using that much water and then only taking in the water that they need, and the rest of the water can be collected through rerun systems. This is very, very helpful for growing plants in space. These plants also have a faster growth rate. So compared to growing plants in a field, they grow at faster rates, which is more convenient for us in space. So we are able to obtain those resources faster, and that's very helpful. Also in space, there's no pest, obviously. So in a normal hydroponic system, less pesticides are already used. So this means that we won't need to use any pesticides, meaning healthier food and less chemicals, and that would be very healthy and helpful for us.
Okay, so this next part, I'm going to talk about the overall cost and cost drivers. This is really fun to me since I'm an accounting and finance major. I like figuring out the cost of things and what the overall cost is allocated to. So I put down some cost drivers, and I put research and development because, of course, we'll need to look into what all really will be needed for this. And we'll have to learn a little bit more than what we know now. We'll also need to pay for salaries and wages, advertising to our sponsors, materials for creating the system, testing of the system before we, of course, bring it to the moon. And then we would need fuel and additional costs of traveling to the moon, and then the potential of extra trips and resources needed, like, for example, to the International Space Station. So the overall cost, since this will be performed by experts, the cost for wages goes up a lot. We would hope to have some sponsors to help cover this cost, and we estimate the cost for this entire mission to be roughly $50 to $60 billion.